Hi BookTube, welcome to another fiction review. If you could combine Anne Tyler's loving, warm, and slightly funny portraits of ordinary Americans, combine that with just the tiniest bit of Mark Twain's snippy satire, then I think the result would be a lot like the novel that we're going to look at today. Today we are reviewing The Greatest Man in Cedar Hole by Stephanie Doyon, published in 2005, 375 pages, and because of the book's age, you can get copies quite reasonably on Amazon, as you can see from the selection of prices that I put on here. What kind of book is this? It is comic fiction, and I would say that it's just unreal enough that you have to think of it more as a fable rather than thinking of the characters as real people that you actually think you could meet, maybe individually, but all together. There's just that slight exaggeration, which I'll talk about a bit more. And it's set in a small town, Kirka, 1940s to late 1960s. It's not entirely sure, and again, I'll explain more about that. This was one of my winning titles, TBR, 13 out of 18. I'm getting there. I'm going to have to try and read 2 books in September, which I'm working on right now, to get through that 18 title TBR list by the end of the year, which I'm still aiming for, and I think I'm still on target. The title of this book might get you thinking, oh, are we focusing on a particular character who is going to turn out to be the greatest man? But that's not the case. The book is really setting up a situation so that at the end, by the time you've read through the whole thing, you can start to ask yourself questions about what qualities really make anybody great, fundamentally. So it sets up this community of people as a way of presenting you with examples of men and women and what they did with their lives over 30 years. It'll poke fun at pretty much everybody, but gently. I reckon it will start a few friendly debates. It'd be a good book group book because I think people would want to talk about the relative merits and flaws of all the characters, definitely. I chose it as kind of a contrast to William Faulkner, and in some ways it is because it's more straightforwardly written, but I found that both Go Down Moses and The Greatest Man in Cedar Hole, they were humorous in their own way, but this is a much more straightforward, funny book to read. A little bit about our author, Stephanie Doyon. Birth year, I had to guess. I think 1974-ish. She doesn't have a big presence online. So she's doing like a lot of modern authors are doing, protecting their privacy very closely. She comes from the state of Maine, and I figure that Cedar Hole, her fictional town, is probably in Maine. If it did exist, it would be somewhere in Maine. Now, for her education, she went to Colby College in 1993. She got a BA in creative writing, and she was studying under the author Richard Russo. And she began as a ghostwriter for the Sweet Valley High series. So, of course, you never saw her real name, because I can't remember. It's Francine somebody, isn't it, that is always credited with being the writer of Sweet Valley High. But, of course, a lot of people can get involved in those books. And then she wrote her own teen series as well, which was called the On the Road series, before she broke out and did this one standalone novel, The Greatest Man in Cedar Hole. Now, there are some online indications that she's working on another novel right now, but I couldn't get a title or any other information or even a publisher. So I'm so sorry. There won't be something interesting that you can look at in the description box about that. Let's talk about the setting. Cedar Hole is a small town. It's described by the narrator as patched together from the discarded scraps of the surrounding hill towns of Palmdale and Mount Etna. Being a generally flat topography where the ground never really dries out, the one source of pride residents can take in their community is the natural lushness of the grass. Otherwise, everything in Cedar Hole seems, not quite up to standard, and that includes the people. No one expects anything or anyone great to come out of Cedar Hole. And the community is fictional. I did do a Google Maps search just to absolutely check it is. And that's why I describe this book as having elements of a fable. The more I think about Cedar Hole, the more I think about it symbolizing all ordinary people, you and me, not famous or rich, not likely to become famous or rich anytime soon. And yet even ordinary people want to be able to look back on the lives they've lived and feel satisfied with them. Now, some will want more. Some will try to find this thing called greatness. But at first, of course, they have to figure out, what does that even mean? Regarding the book's setting in time, it wasn't easy. And this is another way in which the story is fable-like. None of the political events which would occur, big political events between 1945 and 1970, and there were a lot, were there not? There were a lot in the United States. None of these are mentioned. None of these seem to have any effect on the characters. So this really emphasizes and underlines the point that what happens in Cedar Hole it's fable, it's fantasy. It isn't meant to be in the real world. It's meant to be regarded differently. But I did manage to date the book by looking at a couple of things. First of all, there are school-aged children who become the principal characters in the book. And at the start of the novel, their teacher, Miss Pratt, she likes to read True Detective magazine. Now, that magazine was founded in 1925. However, the title of the magazine at first was called True Detective Mysteries, and it wasn't shortened to True Detective until 1941. Okay? Now, about 80 pages in, one of the child characters meets an older couple who've lost their grown-up son. And they've got a picture of him on the wall, and it's a little bit faded, but he's clearly in military uniform. So, and the character gets the feeling that that young man has been dead for some time. So again, that made me move the dating of the start of the book into the 1950s. And then near the end of the book, one of the child characters is grown up, and he presents his aged mother for her 70th birthday with a color television. And this purchase is just, the whole family is blown away that he can afford it. And of course, it's obviously seen as something quite unusual and rare. And I remember from back in the late 60s and early 70s, we did not have a color television until well into the 70s because they were quite expensive. And the people that did have them were, if you did have a color television in, say, 71, 72, all the kids went round your house to watch television. If they had a friend, if I had a school-age friend who had a color television, you tried to work out a way to go to their house so you could watch the cartoons in color, because that was such a treat compared to your black and white at home. So on that basis, I think the story spans a period between roughly 1945 and 1975, give or take a couple of years here and there. But again, big events like the Vietnam War, Watergate, the Kennedy assassination, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Korean War. You wouldn't even know this was going on. You wouldn't really know that this was the real United States, except that you do, because there's just enough cultural hints in that direction. But you have to regard it as not a realistic novel, I think, to enjoy it. Viewpoint in this story is third-person omniscient, and the viewpoint does change, I'd say about once every chapter at least, but you always know it's indicated by an extra space between paragraphs, and also you usually get a sentence or two of preamble when the viewpoint changes, and that always mentions the new viewpoint character by name. Very helpful, so very easy to know who you are with. Now, this whole question of what is greatness does focus to some degree or another on two particular characters, two young boys named Robert and Francis. Francis, also known as Spud. Now, these two boys, they're about the same age, and we're watching them grow up and have families of their own. They have different approaches to life. And to say there's competition between the two of them, it's not that straightforward. Sometimes it's more of a case that the whole rest of the community has decided that there's a competition between them. And the pressure, the community pressure that puts on the two of them sometimes makes them behave as if they were in competition, and also their extended families behave as if there is a competition. Mobility. Cedar Hole is a little bit like Hotel California. Does everybody remember that song by the Eagles? Occasionally, new people do arrive, but nobody ever seems to leave. You learn early on that Cedar Hole has a train station, but it was only open for a few years. It lost so much money because virtually nobody wanted to use it. Occasionally, very occasionally, you might get one or two characters making a trip into the nearby towns of Palmdale or Mount Etna, but no one seems to go any further. You almost think that the rest of the United States doesn't exist until a very key event, a dramatic plot turn, when someone who doesn't belong to any of those three towns turns up in Cedar Hole to help somebody do a little startup business there. The Greatest Man in Cedar Hole is a sympathetic satire, and it's looking at two concepts of greatness that are very popular in Western culture. One, the person who dedicates themselves to a worthy cause, and they sacrifice so much of their personal time and some of their personal finances sometimes to ensure that the cause moves forward and advances. And then there's the person who just works out a way to make a lot of money for themselves and their immediate family. And this book looks at who benefits from both of those concepts, who doesn't. And again, I think you could get a really lively discussion going at any book group if you just asked, okay, Robert and Francis, which one of them achieved greatness truly in the end? Or did they achieve it at all? And the satire is sympathetic because you get to grow up with these characters. Effectively, you understand exactly what makes them tick because you know them since they were babies. And you know exactly why they make their choices. So yes, you shake your head at them sometimes, you laugh at them, but you can see exactly where they're coming from. Content. Let's talk about problematic content. There isn't much, really. And being that this is a comedy and a bit of a fable, I found that even where something dodgy did happen, I couldn't take it seriously because it wasn't as though Stephanie Doyon was trying to create a novel of gritty realism. So some characters swear now and again, and some characters have secret relationships that probably aren't the wisest. And I feel that Doyon treats these faults just as something to mention, but not really something to dwell on. What's going to stand out more to the reader, I think, is just how ordinary everybody is, how not outstanding. And I did a little research on Goodreads, just looked at the 1- and 2-star reviews of The Greatest Man in Cedar Hole to find out what is it that the people who didn't like the book didn't like. And what was consistent was that people felt they disliked the characters because none of them ever got above their ordinary state, and because there's no heroic ending to this novel, not in the traditional sense. And that's why I emphasize the comic nature of the book. These characters, their types, their backstories, and their personal traits, yeah, they're so unpromising. I mean, so they're not going to get anywhere that I think any reader is going to sense that there's a little bit too much exaggeration of those flaws and ordinariness. They're going to recognize comic characters created especially to get a comic effect. And yet I found that these slightly unbelievable people who never rise out of their ordinariness, they did grow on me. I was fond of them. It mattered to me when things went wrong for them. And when I finished the book, I was really glad that I'd met them. As my rabbit hole, I'd just like to give you all a little taste of the writing. One of the slightly exaggerated comic situations that often happens in this novel. We're reading about Francis Pinkham, also known as Spud, who by this time has married Anita, a girl who went to the same high school, and now they have 2 sons, Marty and Flynn. At this point in the novel, Marty is 11 and Flynn is 5. And we're reading from page 173 of the paperback edition. The Pinkhams squeaked by nicely for the first couple of years until Flynn came along, a cyclone of a child who didn't double France's burden but seemed to quadruple it. Flynn had a knack for breaking things, though it didn't seem intentional as much as it was the result of poor timing or unusual coincidence. For example, there was the branch of the sturdy old elm on the front lawn that Marty, who was roughly twice Flynn's size, had been swinging on for years, that snapped the moment Flynn reached for it. Toys in Flynn's custody were dismembered, lost, or crushed within 5 minutes of playing, even though he appeared to treat them no differently than any other child and often seemed more careful. Kitchen chairs came unglued when he sat on them. Glasses of milk tipped themselves over in deference whenever he was near. Francis knew nothing of physics, But Flynn's entropic energy underscored a natural law that he had sensed in his heart. There was only one way for something to be whole, and a million ways for it to fall apart. Occasionally, Flynn's accidents were dangerous, like the time he put his head through a plate glass window in the living room. Francis was behind the house when it happened, cutting down the old holly bush near the back steps because he was afraid Flynn would somehow manage to ingest the berries, even though he had been told repeatedly they were poisonous. Anita was gone grocery shopping, and the boys were in the house playing by themselves. At 10, Marty was serious for his age and seemed mature enough to take care of his 6-year-old brother, though perhaps Francis and Anita had underestimated Flynn's ability to get into trouble, even in the presence of others. Francis was lost in the rhythm of his pruning shears when he heard a loud crack. His first thought was that another sparrow had flown into the living room window. Anita kept her windows spotless, and many birds, drunk on fermented berries, had ascended the spiritual ladder by trying to fly into the house. The deaths were becoming so frequent that Francis stopped pruning the front hedges, partly because the overgrown shrubs covered a portion of the window, and partly because he couldn't stomach the sight of all those birds nestled in the hedges with their necks broken. "Dad!" Marty came to the back door, yelling, "Flynn's head stuck in the window!" Francis couldn't even imagine how he made it inside the house, but somehow his legs carried him. He had expected to see chaos, but the living room was as neat and straight as if Anita had just cleaned for company. The only incongruent bit was Flynn at the window, bent forward at the waist, his head pushed through to the outside and staring down at the shrubs. While the window remained largely intact, a jagged circle of glass teeth surrounded his neck. "How did he manage this?" Francis asked. "How should I know?" Marty said. "I was in my room. You were supposed to be keeping an eye on your brother." Francis approached Flynn slowly and from the side so as not to startle him. "We're going to get you out of there," he said. "Just keep your head still. Can you do that?" "Yes, Pop." "Good boy." "It's funny," Marty said. "The hole looks smaller than his head." He was right. Francis looked at the opening, which hardly seemed an inch larger than the circumference of the boy's neck, and suddenly felt his knees give out beneath him. He reached for the back of a nearby easy-chair to keep himself upright. "I'm not sure about this one," Francis said, scratching his scalp. "You could break the bottom." Marty approached the window and pointed to the cracks just above the sill, "and he could slide his head out. The glass, it'll get in his eyes. We'll cover them up with this." Marty reached behind his father and snatched the handkerchief from his back pocket. "You need one of those big cartoon hammers with the soft top." "A mallet? I think I have one of those in my toolbox." Francis rested his hands on his knees. Even though Marty had laid out a game plan for him, Francis still didn't feel steady enough to trust his own legs. "Go out to the garage and see if you can find the hammer you're talking about. Go, quick." Marty dashed out the front door, the tip of his tongue darting purposefully out of the corner of his mouth. The tendons in Flynn's neck strained to keep his head aloft, although the expression on his face remained relaxed. Francis took a deep, uneasy breath. "You hang on there, boy," he said, lightly patting Flynn's hand. "Prop your hands against the sill if you need to." "I'm all right, Pop. Maybe you could get a towel and put it underneath me, just in case I can't hold out." Finding strength in his legs, Francis darted to the bathroom to retrieve a towel. Flynn was always calm during his accidents, but Francis couldn't help but think that a little fear was helpful, that it might stop him from getting into bad situations in the first place. The time Flynn was almost clocked by the elm branch, Francis sat the boy down and tried to give him a lesson about the nature of cause and effect. "If that branch had hit you on the head, you could have been killed," he had said, hoping his son understood enough about death to avoid launching into that whole discussion, or ended up stupid for the rest of your life. "It touched my back," Flynn had answered. "But it could have hit your head, see? It came real close." "It didn't hit me, though." The conversation went around and around in spirals as Francis tried to make the boy understand the meaning of almost. By the time he gave up, he was no closer. Flynn was firm in his belief that things either happened or they didn't. There was no such thing as almost. And that's the review done. So I hope that gives you enough of an idea to decide whether or not that's your kind of reading. There's not a lot in the description box today, I'm afraid, but let's tell you what's coming up. So in the next few days, we have got another tag. I'm going to do the I Dare You tag. And then also, I think probably what you're going to get next is the first vlog as I look at this gigantic concrete breeze block of a book, Religion and the Decline of Magic by Keith Thomas. It is a very important work in the history of religion and religious thought in England, published in the 1970s, but there really hasn't been another book to cover the subject matter as well as Thomas has. And so I hope you'll join me in a few days' time to have a look at that. Okay, and until I see you then, take care. Bye-bye.